What if the most dangerous person in your life isn't the obvious villain with threats and anger, but the one subtly undermining your eudaimonia while calling themselves your ally? Ancient Stoics like Marcus Aurelius understood this paradox centuries before modern psychology gave us terms like covert aggression and psychological manipulation. Today, we'll examine 5 behavioral patterns that would have alarmed even the most composed Stoic philosopher. Signs that someone may be systematically dismantling your tranquility while maintaining plausible deniability. The wisdom to identify these patterns might be the most powerful application of Stoicism you'll ever practice. Sign 1: consistent manipulation and deception. Let's examine the first and perhaps most insidious warning sign that someone intends your destruction. A persistent pattern of manipulation and deception that systematically undermines your grasp on reality itself. Imagine this. You clearly remember a conversation where your colleague promised to support your project, yet today they look you directly in the eyes and claim the discussion never happened. As confusion washes over you, a creeping doubt begins to form. Could your memory be failing? Perhaps you misunderstood? This unsettling uncertainty becomes a familiar companion as similar incidents multiply, each one eroding your confidence in your own perceptions. What's truly happening in these moments beneath the surface of everyday interaction? You're experiencing what modern psychologists call gaslighting, but what the ancient Stoics recognized as a fundamental assault on your capacity for reason, your most essential faculty for navigating reality. When confronted with manipulation, most people initially try to reconcile contradictions by doubting themselves. They surrender their own perceptions, believing this will restore harmony and preserve the relationship. However, this self-doubt becomes a widening crack in your psychological foundation, one that manipulators expertly exploit to further destabilize your reality. The consequences? Your decision-making becomes increasingly dependent on external validation rather than internal wisdom. But what if your confusion isn't evidence of your failings, but rather a natural response to deliberate deception? This is where Stoic philosophy offers a powerful alternative framework. Unlike modern approaches that might encourage endless analysis of the manipulator's motives, Stoicism directs our attention inward, to the cultivation of what Epictetus called our ruling faculty, the capacity to distinguish between appearance and reality, regardless of external influences. The Stoic virtue of practical wisdom, phronesis, functions as an internal compass that can detect inconsistencies even when emotions cloud judgment. Marcus Aurelius reminds us, "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth by which no one was ever truly harmed." Yet this openness to correction differs fundamentally from the destabilization that manipulators create. When applying Stoic principles to potential manipulation, first establish a practice of dispassionate observation. Document patterns rather than isolated incidents. Then, rather than immediately reacting, create distance through what the Stoics called the pause, a moment of reflection where you ask, what judgment am I making about this situation, and is it serving the truth? Like a skilled navigator differentiating between true north and magnetic north, train yourself to distinguish between genuine uncertainty and manufactured doubt. The manipulator's power, like a mirage in the desert, dissolves when subjected to the clear light of documented reality. I once worked closely with a team member who had a remarkable ability to rewrite history. During one particularly challenging project, they had explicitly agreed to handle 3 critical deliverables: As the deadline approached and their work remained incomplete, I gently inquired about progress. Their response left me questioning my sanity. "We never discussed me taking those on. You must be thinking of someone else." Despite my vivid memory of our conversation, including specific details about implementation approaches we'd discussed, they maintained this position with such conviction that I began to doubt myself. Instead of continuing this disorienting exchange, I paused and recalled the Stoic practice of focusing on what is within my control. I had fortunately followed my usual practice of documenting our meeting outcomes. Rather than accusingly presenting this evidence, I simply said, "I understand we may remember things differently. Let's look at how we can move forward productively." I then shared my notes as a neutral reference point, framing it as clarification rather than confrontation. What happened next revealed volumes. Rather than engaging with the documented reality, they immediately shifted to defensive accusations about my obsessive note-taking and lack of trust. This disproportionate reaction to simple facts confirmed what my internal alarm system had been signaling. The Stoics understood that virtue reveals itself not in words, but in consistent actions. When someone's behavior creates a persistent discrepancy between your experience of reality and their account of it, this isn't merely a communication problem. It's a deliberate strategy to disempower you by disconnecting you from your most valuable asset, your capacity for clear judgment. The deeper lesson here transcends this specific interaction. By maintaining what the Stoics called cognitive distance, the space between an event and our judgment about it, we preserve our autonomy even when others attempt to subvert it. As Epictetus wisely counseled, make it your study to see things for what they truly are, stripping away the covering of opinion. This clear-sightedness becomes our greatest protection against those who would reshape our reality to serve their destructive ends. Sign 2. Lack of empathy and disregard for others' well-being. Now let's turn our attention to the second critical warning sign that reveals destructive intent. A profound lack of empathy coupled with a consistent disregard for the well-being of others, a trait that ancient Stoics would have immediately recognized as antithetical to our fundamental nature as social beings. Picture yourself sharing a significant personal challenge with someone you trust, perhaps a health scare or family crisis that has left you vulnerable. As you speak, you notice something unsettling. While their words might express concern, their eyes remain cold, calculating, almost as if they're mentally cataloging your weaknesses rather than connecting with your humanity. In the days that follow, you're struck by how quickly they leverage your vulnerable disclosure during a disagreement, wielding your pain as a weapon against you. The emotional whiplash is disorienting. How could someone who claimed to care use your suffering so strategically? This jarring disconnect between expected empathy and encountered callousness signals something far more troubling than mere social awkwardness. What you're witnessing is the hallmark of someone who fundamentally views others not as fellow humans deserving of dignity, but as mere instruments to be utilized for personal advantage. When confronted with such cold-blooded behavior, many people instinctively make excuses. Perhaps they're just having a bad day, or maybe they don't understand how hurtful their actions are. Consequently, they continue engaging with the person, hoping that with enough patience and explanation, empathy will eventually emerge. Unfortunately, this approach often leads to a progressive erosion of boundaries and self-respect, as the empathy-deficient individual continually transgresses natural social limits without consequence. Moreover, this pattern typically escalates rather than improves over time, as the person learns they can act with impunity. But what if this lack of empathy isn't a temporary lapse, but rather a permanent feature of their character? What if no amount of explanation or patience will cultivate what nature has not provided? This is where Stoic philosophy offers a profound shift in perspective, one that centers not on futile attempts to change another's nature, but on recognizing reality clearly and responding virtuously to protect your own eudaimonia. The Stoics understood that human beings are inherently social creatures, naturally inclined toward what they called oikeiosis, a process of appropriation or familiarization that expands our circle of concern from ourselves to include our family, community, and ultimately all of humanity. Hierocles, a Stoic philosopher, described this as concentric circles of concern, with each person extending empathy outward in ever-widening circles. Therefore, someone who consistently fails to display even basic empathy is functioning contrary to human nature itself, like a fish that refuses to swim or a bird that rejects flight. To apply this understanding practically, first develop what the Stoics called phantasia cataleptic, comprehensive impressions, by cataloging patterns rather than isolated incidents. Notice especially the disconnect between words and actions. Many who lack empathy have learned to mimic its language, while their behavior reveals their true orientation. Second, practice the Stoic discipline of assent, deliberately withholding judgment until you've gathered sufficient evidence. Finally, implement the discipline of action by establishing clear boundaries that protect your well-being, regardless of whether the other person understands or approves of these limits. Like a gardener who wisely places thorny plants behind a fence to prevent injury, you can maintain appropriate distance without malice. I once maintained a friendship with someone I'll call Alex, who initially impressed me with their charisma and apparent interest in philosophical discussions. During a particularly difficult period when my parent was diagnosed with a serious illness, I confided in Alex about my fears and struggles. Their response seemed appropriate on the surface. They offered the right words and expressions of concern. However, the very next day at a group dinner, I was stunned when Alex casually mentioned my parents' condition to gain sympathy from others, sharing details I had explicitly asked to keep private. When I later expressed how painful this breach of trust had been, instead of apologizing, Alex responded with remarkable coldness. "Everyone has problems. You shouldn't be so sensitive about it." I felt a familiar surge of doubt. Was I overreacting? Rather than immediately withdrawing from the friendship, I decided to apply Stoic principles by observing patterns more deliberately. I began noticing how Alex consistently centered conversations on themselves, displayed animation only when discussing their own concerns, and subtly dismissed others' emotions while demanding extensive attention for their own. Instead of confronting Alex with accusations, I quietly adjusted my boundaries, limiting what I shared and gradually reducing contact. When Alex eventually demanded an explanation for my distance, I simply stated, "I've noticed that we have different expectations from friendship, and I'm making choices that align with my values." What surprised me most wasn't Alex's initial reaction of anger, which I had anticipated, but rather how quickly they moved on to find new sources of emotional supply without any apparent distress about the loss of our friendship. This outcome confirmed what Stoic philosophy had prepared me to understand, that empathy isn't merely a social skill, but a fundamental orientation toward recognizing humanity in others. Its absence signals not a temporary lapse, but a profound misalignment with the social nature that defines healthy human interaction. The deeper wisdom here extends beyond this specific relationship. As Epictetus taught, remember that you are an actor in a play of such a kind as the author pleases to make it. When we encounter those who consistently demonstrate a lack of empathy, we aren't obligated to continue playing complementary roles in their drama. The Stoic virtue of justice calls us to treat all with fairness and respect, including ourselves. By recognizing and respecting the natural boundaries that empathy normally establishes, we protect not only our own well-being, but also uphold the social fabric that Stoicism recognizes as essential to human flourishing. Sign 3. Cultivating negative emotions and instability in others. Moving forward to our third crucial indicator, let's explore perhaps the most subtle yet psychologically devastating sign of destructive intent. The deliberate cultivation of negative emotions and emotional instability in others, a tactic that directly undermines the cornerstone of Stoic practice. Consider a situation where after each interaction with a particular colleague, friend, or family member, you find yourself inexplicably drained, anxious, or filled with self-doubt. Despite entering these encounters in a balanced state of mind, you consistently leave feeling emotionally dysregulated, perhaps questioning your competence, feeling unreasonably guilty, or experiencing a surge of anger that seems disproportionate to the actual exchange. This emotional turbulence follows a pattern so consistent that it becomes almost predictable, yet mysteriously, this person seems perfectly composed while you struggle to regain your equilibrium. What's particularly confusing is that you don't experience this pattern with others in your life. So why does this specific relationship leave you feeling like a ship tossed in a storm that appeared out of nowhere? Could it be that this emotional destabilization isn't accidental, but rather the intended outcome of a carefully orchestrated approach? When experiencing such emotional turbulence, most people instinctively look inward, blaming themselves for their overreactions or sensitivity. Consequently, they often redouble their efforts to control their emotions, becoming increasingly self-critical when these efforts fail. This inward focus, however, creates a dangerous blind spot. By assuming full responsibility for the emotional dynamics, they fail to recognize the external provocations deliberately designed to destabilize them. As a result, they become trapped in a cycle of emotional vulnerability that actually strengthens the manipulator's influence. But what if your emotional responses aren't a reflection of your weakness, but rather a natural human reaction to psychological warfare? What if your discomfort is actually your innate wisdom, signaling that something is fundamentally wrong with the interaction? This perspective aligns perfectly with Stoic philosophy, which, contrary to popular misconception, doesn't advocate for emotional suppression, but rather for emotional intelligence and appropriate response. The Stoics understood emotions not as irrational forces to be eliminated, but as cognitive judgments about what matters in life. Epictetus taught that emotions arise from our judgments about events, not from the events themselves. Therefore, someone who systematically attempts to provoke negative emotions is essentially trying to corrupt your judgment, the very faculty that Stoicism considers most sacred to human nature. To apply Stoic principles when facing such manipulation, first practice what Seneca called premeditatio malorum, premeditation of evils, mentally rehearsing challenging interactions before they occur. This preparation creates psychological distance that helps you maintain perspective when provocations arise. Second, implement the discipline of perception by asking yourself, what alternative interpretations exist for this provocation? This question interrupts the automatic emotional response the manipulator is counting on. Finally, employ the Stoic technique of stepping back by imagining yourself as a calm observer of the interaction rather than an emotionally entangled participant. Like a skilled martial artist who redirects an opponent's force rather than meeting it head-on, you can learn to recognize emotional provocations without absorbing their impact. The goal isn't to become emotionless, but to ensure that your emotions remain proportionate and serve your well-being rather than someone else's agenda. I once had a family member who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to trigger precisely the emotional responses that would destabilize me most effectively. During holiday gatherings, they would casually mention my past mistakes in front of others, using a tone so light that objecting would make me appear oversensitive. If I remained composed, they would escalate by asking pointed questions about areas of my life where I felt vulnerable, all while maintaining a facade of innocent curiosity. Initially, I responded with either defensive anger or awkward silence, both of which left me feeling diminished and somewhat ashamed of my reactions. The pattern continued until I noticed something revealing. This person seemed most satisfied when I was visibly upset, as though my emotional destabilization was the actual goal of their behavior. Rather than continuing this pattern, I decided to apply Stoic principles by mentally rehearsing potential provocations before our next interaction. When the familiar tactics emerged, instead of reacting immediately, I paused and silently asked myself, what judgment am I making about this comment that is causing my emotional response? This created just enough space for me to respond with calm curiosity rather than defensive emotion. That's an interesting thing to bring up in this context. What made you think of that right now? What happened next was truly illuminating. Faced with my calm inquiry rather than emotional reactivity, they appeared momentarily confused before quickly changing the subject. Without my emotional response to feed upon, their strategy lost its power. Even more revealing was how quickly they moved on to another potential target in the room, confirming that the behavior was indeed deliberate rather than accidental. This experience taught me what the Stoics understood centuries ago, that our emotions are valuable signals, not weaknesses to be suppressed. When someone consistently provokes negative emotional states, they aren't merely being difficult, they're attempting to control you through the manipulation of your emotional responses. The Stoic principle of progress, isn't about eliminating emotions, but about developing the wisdom to recognize when they're being deliberately manipulated. As Marcus Aurelius wisely counseled, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. By recognizing deliberate emotional manipulation for what it is, an attempt to undermine your autonomy and well-being, you reclaim the very power that manipulators seek to diminish. This recognition isn't just protective, it's liberating, allowing you to engage with genuine emotions while skillfully navigating those that others attempt to artificially induce. Sign 4. Blame shifting and avoidance of responsibility. As we continue our exploration, let's now examine the fourth critical warning sign that reveals destructive intent. A persistent pattern of blame shifting and responsibility avoidance. A behavior pattern that stands in direct opposition to the foundational Stoic virtue of personal accountability. Imagine you've just discovered a significant error in a collaborative project, one that will require substantial time and effort to correct. When you bring this to your partner's attention, instead of acknowledging their contribution to the problem, they immediately launch into an elaborate explanation of how your actions force their hand, how external circumstances made perfection impossible, and how, in fact, you should have caught the error earlier if you were truly competent. As you listen to this bewildering reversal of reality, a familiar knot forms in your stomach. You entered the conversation seeking resolution, but now find yourself mysteriously defending your own actions instead. Sign 5. Excessive desire for control and diminishment of others. Finally, let's examine perhaps the most fundamental sign of destructive intent. An excessive desire for control coupled with systematic efforts to diminish your self-worth. Behaviors that directly contradict the Stoic understanding of human autonomy and dignity. Imagine finding yourself in a relationship, professional, personal, or romantic, where your decisions increasingly require another's approval. Your perspectives are subtly but consistently undermined, and your confidence in your own judgment steadily erodes. Initially, this dynamic might appear as helpfulness or guidance, perhaps even concern for your well-being. Over time, however, you notice a disturbing pattern. Each of your independent choices meets resistance, while your successes are minimized and your failures magnified. Your social connections outside this relationship gradually weaken as you find yourself explaining and justifying your interactions with others. The psychological terrain becomes increasingly treacherous, like walking through a field where hidden triggers could detonate at any moment. You develop a hyper-vigilance about saying or doing the wrong thing. What began as a seemingly supportive relationship has transformed into an invisible cage, constructed so gradually that you scarcely notice the bars forming around your autonomy. Could it be that this progressive limitation of your freedom isn't an unfortunate byproduct, but rather the very purpose of the relationship? When experiencing such controlling dynamics, most people instinctively adapt by narrowing their range of actions and expressions to avoid conflict or criticism. Consequently, they gradually surrender more territory of their autonomy, often rationalizing the shrinking freedom as necessary compromise or even as proof of their commitment to the relationship. This accommodation, however, creates a dangerous feedback loop. Each concession reinforces the controller's sense of entitlement, while simultaneously diminishing the target's resistance to future encroachments. Eventually, the controlled person's sense of self becomes so entangled with the controller's expectations that separation feels nearly impossible. But what if this relational dynamic isn't simply difficult, but fundamentally antithetical to human nature itself? What if the progressive erosion of your autonomy violates not merely your preferences, but your inherent dignity as a rational being? This perspective aligns perfectly with Stoic philosophy, which identifies our capacity for independent judgment as the defining characteristic of human nature, and therefore views attempts to colonize another's autonomy as a profound violation of the natural order. At the heart of Stoicism lies what Epictetus called the dichotomy of control, the understanding that some things fall within our power, our judgments, impulses, desires, and aversions, while others remain outside it, our bodies, possessions, reputations, and status. This foundational principle reveals the fundamental irrationality of attempting to control another person's choices, as such control inevitably targets what properly belongs to them alone. As Epictetus teaches, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. Recognizing the signs of potentially harmful intent in others is a valuable skill that aligns with the Stoic pursuit of wisdom and a well-lived life. By observing behaviors such as consistent manipulation and deception, a lack of empathy, the cultivation of negative emotions, blame shifting, and an excessive desire for control, individuals can gain a clearer understanding of the dynamics within their relationships. These signs, when viewed through the lens of core Stoic principles like virtue ethics, the dichotomy of control, and the importance of reason and justice, provide a framework for discerning potentially destructive patterns. Ultimately, while understanding the intentions of others can be helpful for self-awareness and protection, the central focus of Stoicism remains on our own inner state and our commitment to virtuous actions. By applying Stoic principles, individuals can navigate relationships with greater clarity, resilience, and peace of mind, striving for their own eudaimonia regardless of the intentions of those around them.